Okay, enough talking. We need to actually code up some classes. So let's make our first class here. And we're going to make a class that describes a pet dog. Remember that a class is a blueprint for objects. A class on its own doesn't do much, but it defines what kind of attributes and methods that an object is going to have. Attributes you can think of as things that the object knows, and methods are things that the object can do. So we start out our class definition with the keyword class. And we will call our class pet dog. Now, so far we've used a lowercase underscore convention for variable names and function names. When we create a class, the convention is to use upper camel case. That means that every word is capitalized, and we don't use underscores. So if we're going to have a pet dog class, we call it capital P, E-T, capital D, O-G, pet dog. And we put a colon after the name to indicate that a code block follows. Everything that follows at this level of indentation is part of the class. Now we need to figure out how to define the methods and attributes that this class knows. Now, one method that all classes have is called a constructor method. And in Python, we call it init. We use the double underscore. It's a magic method in that it's automatically called when we create a class. And even if we don't define an init method, there's a default method that Python will use. But generally, we want an init method. Methods are just the same as functions. Notice that they start with the keyword def, and they have a parameter list. And when I started typing this method signature, PyCharm automatically put this self parameter in the parameter list. We'll come back and talk about that in a minute. But I can add another parameter, and I'm going to call it name. It should be a string, and that will represent the name of the dog I'm creating. Inside this constructor method, I'm going to print out an f string. It will include the name that was passed, and a little message to indicate that our object was created. Now that's actually enough to define a class. I can use that class petDog now to create dog objects. So I might say, for instance, my dog equals the name of the class petDog, and in parentheses the required parameter, which is name. I'll put in Fido. So I'm telling Python here that I want to create an object of the petDog class. When I use the name of the class followed by parentheses and fill in the required arguments, Python creates an object. After creating the object, it's assigning the object to the name myDog. Let's just see what's happening so far. I'm going to run this code. And I get a message, Fido is born. Let's track back into the program and see what happened. I asked Python to create an object of type petDog. Python looks up at the class definition for petDog and tries to find a constructor or init method. It finds that method, so it's going to run that method. I provided an argument Fido, which becomes the parameter name, and inside the method there's a single command that says print fstring name is born, so we printed Fido is born. That's fantastic, and we can even make sure that we have the right type here. So let's print type of my dog and run this again. And we see that my dog is of the class petDog. Now I haven't actually defined any attributes for Fido. He doesn't even really know his name, because remember that when we call a function, and a method is just a type of function, everything in the parameter list becomes a local variable. And when the function or method finishes its job, all of those objects are released, and they don't exist anymore. So even though I called my dog Fido, and even though the object exists in memory, the name Fido no longer does, because it was lost as soon as the constructor was finished doing its work. What we want to do, and what we usually do in a constructor method, is define the attributes that are going to be persistent in the class. So we'd like to actually save Fido's name somewhere. And we'll do it like this. Remember, we said we'd put off talking about self, and I'm going to ask for just a little more patience there. But for now, know that self refers to Fido, the object that we're talking about. And here we're creating a reference within Fido that's going to stick with Fido. We call it an attribute, and our attribute is underscore name. And we're going to take the name that was passed into this constructor, which in this case is Fido, and we're going to bind it to that attribute, self._name. Once we do that, now we have a permanent home for that name. The variable name will cease to exist when the function finishes its work, but we're going to take the string that name refers to and permanently attach it to the attribute self._name. So Fido will remember his name. So now Fido has an attribute, something he knows. But we'd like to give Fido a method besides the constructor. We'd like to have Fido be able to do something. For instance, we'd like to have Fido bark. Notice again, as soon as I hit the parentheses, PyCharm inserts this self parameter into the parameter list. We're ready now to talk about what self is. Let's try with a little analogy. Think of a teacher in a classroom with 30 students. And the teacher is starting a math lesson, and the teacher says, okay, now you need to pick up your pencil and you need to write the number 2 on your paper. But who is you? The teacher is talking to 30 different students. Every student has their own pencil and their own piece of paper. And every student understands when the teacher says you, they're getting a personal instruction to pick up their own pencil and write on their own paper. Self is kind of like that you that the teacher is using. It's the individual object that's receiving some kind of instruction. For example, it could be the MyDog object. We could be telling MyDog to bark. In that case, MyDog, the whole object, is placed into the self parameter, and it's going to be accessible as we use our method. So we want you to bark. We want self to bark. Who is that? It's going to be MyDog. So we're creating this method that's generically going to say, you write the number 2 on your piece of paper, or in this case, you need to bark. And it could be any object of the pet dog class. So we'll use that self parameter in the place of the object. We'll say print, and we're going to use an F string here, self._name. So that's referring to the name of a particular object of the pet dog class. But it could be any object of the pet dog class. It says woof. When we're ready to use this method, we start by typing the name of an object of the pet dog class. We use a dot to indicate we're reaching into that object, and we type the name of the method, bark. The self parameter is passed automatically to the method. We don't need to pass that. So we just do empty parentheses. There's no information we need to give the method. It's already going to receive the MyDog object automatically. We'll run this code. When it gets down to this line, the Python interpreter says, okay, the MyDog object wants to run a method called bark. So it says, okay, what kind of class is MyDog? It's a pet dog class. Okay, let me look in the definition of that class to see if I can find a method called bark. Here it is. And the interpreter says, let me place the MyDog object into the self parameter. Then all the attributes of MyDog are going to be available. When we get to the print statement, self really refers to MyDog. We know the name of MyDog is Fido. So when we say print self._name, we're referred to that Fido string. And Fido says woof. So we go to all the trouble of defining a class, usually so that we can create more than one object of that class. We can create MyDog and also your dog. Your dog's name is Spot. We'll take this statement out, and we'll have MyDog bark and your dog. When we run this code, we see that Fido says woof and Spot says woof. When we call the bark method using the MyDog object, MyDog is placed into the parameter self so that we can access the specific attribute _name associated with MyDog, which is different from your dog. When we ask your dog to bark, the object your dog is placed into self so that we get the right name back. Please ask questions until that becomes clear.